Hello, everybody. My name is Jane Montgomery Griffiths. Now, some of you will have met me last week when I delivered this lecture in person. Some of you might not have. Unfortunately, last week's lecture didn't record, so I'm doing this now as a refresher for those of you who are in the lecture, or as a catch-up for those of you who were unable to make it. Now, before we begin, I just want to say a few things. We are living in extraordinary times. Confusing, distressing, frustrating, and for some people, scary times. I want you to know that even though we can't meet in person, we in the Centre for Theatre and Performance, we are here for you. So there are a number of ways that you can come to us just to talk through how you're feeling, whether that be about your unit or generally about your time at university, because I'm very aware that for many of you, this is very upsetting. You had lots of expectations about what university would be like. You might have come to this country specifically to join at university at Monash, and all of those things have been upended. So if you want to talk, please email me at jane.griffiths.monash.edu. You'll see the address down below. Then we can arrange a FaceTime meeting or a phone call or a Zoom meeting. But I want you to know that you are not alone. Now, I am first year coordinator, so I'm the go-to person for any issues that you might have. So please, please feel free to contact me if you want to discuss anything. It's really important that you feel that you are part of our community. There's this term going around, social distancing. Well, instead I would like to say physical distancing with social contact. So you're not alone. It's no good if you feel isolated. That's when you need to come to us for help. Okay, so for the next 3 weeks of this unit, I will be taking you through a few things about Greek theatre, ancient Greek theatre. I want to begin by telling you a story. So cast your minds back into Neanderthal times around about 1983 in the UK, January. Absolutely freezing. I want you to imagine us all with icicles falling off our leg warmers, our shaggy perms full of sleet and snow, sitting in a freezing cold porter cabin with the toxic fumes from our paraffin heater. We were studying an O-level called Greek Literature in Translation. Now, for those of you who don't know, O-levels back in the 80s were the exams that you took in year 10. So there are 2 points of exit from school in the UK. One was O-levels, now called GCSEs. You took those in year 10. Then you could leave school. If you were academic, you'd carry on for 2 years to take A-levels, which is kind of like VCE, but more specialist. So there we were, 23 girls stuck in this freezing class studying Greek literature in translation O-level. Now, it might sound as though that was a kind of culturally, an O-level with cultural kudos, because it sounds a bit posh, doesn't it, Greek literature? But it wasn't. In fact, it was the class where people who couldn't do anything else or whose timetable didn't fit were dumped. So we'd been studying the Odyssey. We were bored of that. It was January. I was thinking, why didn't I take German instead? And then suddenly we opened up this new text. It was called Electra by Sophocles. The first 2 pages were a bit dull, really. 2 blokes talking about a shrine and one of them being loyal like a horse and the other one going to be making up a story about his own death. And I wasn't particularly excited. But then at the bottom of page 2, there was a cry from inside the palace, a woman's cry. The men listen, decide to do nothing about it, bugger off. This woman comes out and for the next 1,000 lines just talks in grief. She does through talking. It becomes a play about women, about what women can do and can't do, about active passivity. And I am completely taken hook, line and sinker. I am gone. I have fallen madly in love with this character, with this play, with Greek tragedy in particular. I feel this coursing of adrenaline in my stomach, my palms tingling, the hair on my arm stands up, and that's it. So I decide then and there, I have to become an actress. So one day I will play this part. I have to learn ancient Greek so I can understand this play, and that's it. So this play has, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes very determinedly, shaped my life. I've ended up being the understudy for one of the most famous productions in British theatre history. I've played the chorus, I've directed the play, both in English and ancient Greek. I played Electra for 6 months, almost killing myself in the process. I've played Clytemnestra. I basically know this play inside out, back to front. I've even done my PhD on it. This all came from being 14 and reading a play in an O-level that hadn't seemed to be promising anything much, but changed my life. So I want us to think for an instant about what is happening on a personal level. Something through this play 2,500 years ago hit me like a lightning bolt. Then I want us to look at this. So here we have the text that we were studying. Let's just look at this image for a moment. It's a book. That's the first thing we can say about it. It's a book with the rather unprepossessing title of Greek Tragedies 2. Think about the connotations of that. Oh my God, there are more Greek tragedies. There was a Greek tragedy 1, there's probably a Greek tragedies 3. How far does it go? Greek tragedies 5, maybe. And we have 3 different playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and 5 different plays clumped together on the title page, on what do you call this? The frontispiece of this book. Aeschylus's Libation Bearers, Sophocles, Electra, Euripides, Iphigenia in Tauris, Electra and Trojan Women. 4 of those plays linked together by a myth, the Trojan Women just sticking out like a sore thumb, frankly. And let's look who wrote this book. Richard Lattimore and David Green. Editors. Translators. So let's go back to Greek literature in translation O-level. Think about your VCE board. A group of teachers sat in a room just by the Catholic cathedral in Melbourne. I know because I used to set the exam papers. A group of teachers sat there, a couple of academics too, like me, and they decided what were the set texts for classics this year for the VCE. Presumably the same happened in the 1980s in Britain. A group of teachers sat round and said, yes, this is the text that we will study. But more than that, a group of head honchos higher in the pecking order than the teachers had decided that we would create an examination called Greek Literature in Translation. So this has all to do with what we can call a hegemony. In Australia, it's often pronounced hegemony. I don't like doing that because thinking about Pinocchio, it reminds me of hegemony cricket. Now, a hegemony, it comes from the Greek word hagor, which means I lead. A hegemony is a group of people who create the cultural zeitgeist, who decide what is literature, what is art, what is culturally valid, what we should study. Somewhere along the line, people decided that Greek tragedies were something that we should study. They set it as an academic text. But I want you again to look at this book. How interesting is this book? Does this book cover convey in any way, shape or form that extraordinary agenal surge that changed my life when I was 14, when I first read Sophocles' Electra? Is there anything about this text that says this is a living play? These are plays that can be performed, can be embodied? No. And that's the problem with a lot of the way that we study Greek tragedy, because these plays have been translated very rarely by theatre practitioners and mostly by academics, by classicists, just like me. I went off to Cambridge and studied ancient Greek and Latin. And I knew that out of the faculty at Cambridge, there was not one person who had any concrete, practical, embodied knowledge of the theatre. I frankly was the only one. And when I go back there, I'm still considered as a delicate flower, an exotic beast, because I've actually performed these plays. So you guys approaching Greek tragedy have an amount of, what shall we say, baggage. First of all, there's the term ancient, and that carries with it connotations. For some of you, it will be rubble. For some of you, broken down, ruined monuments. For some of you, something that you studied at school. For some of you, sheets and safety pins in your school play. Then we have Greek. Now, Greek's an interesting one. We see Greek and a couple of things happen. For those of you who have Greek ancestry, Greek ethnicity, then immediately there's a sense of connection. I am an Australian Greek, a Greek Australian. Even the way you say that, does Greek go first or Australian go first? That is saying something about who you are. But for others who have no Greek ethnicity or heritage, Greek has connotations of, what should we say, oldness. People in, as everybody says, togas. Togas were Roman. We're talking about chitons and peplos in Greece. But basically, a proper version of the sheets and safety pins that most of you will have used in school plays if you ever did any of these tragedies. And we think of Greek and we think old, ancient, thousands and thousands of years old. Guess what? Greece has only been around for about 180 years. 1820s was when Greece was formed. Before that, we had 1820s, 200 years. There we go. My maths has never been good. Before that, we had a disparate group of ethnic identities, city-states, people sent into exile, into the great diaspora. There was no such thing as Greece. What there was a sense of identity. And that makes a difference for those of us who have no Greek heritage. Then we have theatre. That is probably the one with the greatest connotations for you. Something made you decide to study theatre here at Monash. So think about what theatre means to you. Does it mean a school play? Does it mean a community theatre project that you've seen because your parents are in it, or your big sister, or your friend next door? Does it mean Billy Elliot? I tell you what it probably doesn't mean for you, though. A radical, political, cultural, and religious entity that is part of your identity as a citizen. So your understanding of these terms, ancient Greek theatre, and your baggage says something very important about what we might call your reception of this subject. Now, classical reception studies, it's kind of a growth market. It's been going for about 20 years, and this is what I do in my research. It's basically not saying what is the meaning of this play, as though there has been a stable meaning for 2,500 years. It's saying, what does this play do for people now? How do people now interpret it and understand it? And so that has to do with baggage. Do you carry your understanding of these terms in a suitcase, a rucksack, or a plastic bag? It might seem kind of fake and coy that I'm using these words, but it's not actually. Think what you can fit into a suitcase, quite a lot. And the rectangular nature of the suitcase suggests that there's going to be order. There's going to be, well, what shall we say, the sort of academic rigor, in inverted commas, that we had in Greek tragedy in translation O-level. But if you carry a rucksack, then you're just shoving everything in, all of your understanding of ancient Greek theatre into the bottom of the rucksack, along with a bit of Shakespeare and maybe some psychology and some criminology if you're studying that. Basically, you are not seeing an ordered hierarchy. It's just something that goes in with everything else. And if your baggage is a plastic bag, well then frankly, you don't give a damn about Greek theatre. You're just doing this module because it fits into your timetable. And there is a hole at the bottom of the plastic bag, which you have resented paying 15 cents for in IGA, and your Greek tragedy is dropping out the bottom. This metaphor is kind of important because it fits incredibly well with the idea of reception. You all carry different baggage, and even the weight of that baggage, the suitcase kind of lumbersome versus the rucksack, just stick it on your back and go, versus the plastic bag, absolutely expendable. All of those things completely and totally correspond to your understanding of this subject. So I want us to talk about connotations then, and how your understanding and reception might be framed. Greek tragedy, let's think about a chorus, masks, long speeches, unison speaking. It's basically tedious, isn't it? If you have seen Greek tragedy, chances are there were many moments when you thought, oh, how long is this? Luckily, Greek tragedies are rarely over 90 minutes, but if they go past 90 minutes, you know that somebody is being very self-indulgent and it's going to be extremely dull. So tedium is something that we often associate with something like Greek tragedy, and a sense of alienation. What do we do with a chorus? We understand a chorus in musicals, but how does a chorus work in Greek? Masks, what are they about? Understanding what a mask does, that's just weird. The whole frame of the long speeches that they have, of the unison speaking, it's tricky to understand. So let's have a look at this image. This image comes from what's known as the Pronomus vase, 5th century, and it provides classicists with the most concrete, which is ironic given it's on a pot, concrete understanding of the practicalities of Greek theatre. So here we have two actors. The one on your, hang on, I'm doing stage left, stage right. As you're looking at it, the one on your left is carrying a mask and also a club. The one on your right, an old man's mask and lion skin. So we know from the iconography, that means how we read the signs. We know from the iconography of this image that we are dealing with a play about Heracles, because the club and the lion's pelt are part of the way that we convey Heracles. But there's something interesting happening with the mimetic frame. Now, mimesis is the Greek word that basically means representation. So when we talk about mimetic frame, we're talking about the way that representation and, in fact, pretending comes together. Two virile young men, middle-aged men maybe by the growth of their beards, are about to become other people by putting on these masks. And behind you can see a mask of a woman, and in front we have young men crowned with laurels who are about to participate in the rituals of the god Dionysus. Let's contrast this with this image. Now, what do you think about this? We might laugh at this image. Look at this. It looks like everything that's terrible about Greek tragedy. Lots of blokes with fake beards and dreadful costumes. We look at it and we think, how ridiculous. Well, I would like to counteract that by suggesting that this image is of one of the most radical and innovative productions ever to have taken place in the UK in the 19th century. It comes from the very first Cambridge Greek play. So in the 1880s, a couple of academics decided that instead of studying ancient Greek theatre and also literature in texts on the page in ancient Greek, like I did when I was a student there, instead of that, they were going to perform a tragedy. They were going to take this text, this written text off the page, as in the Greek tragedies too, and embody it with people on a stage to be seen. This is the first time in British theatre history there had ever been a full-length performance of a Greek tragedy. So we look at it now and we might laugh, but think about how extraordinarily innovative and radical this was. And indeed, it was so successful and so popular that special Greek play trains were put on from King's Cross in London to Cambridge because they needed to have extra capacity for the huge audiences that came to see this play. The Cambridge Greek play is now done every 3 years. And in fact, I was the artistic director of it for between 1998 and 2001. And we still do plays in ancient Greek, this time in a much more radical and, shall we say, theatrically cognizant way of looking at it. You'll see that on this page, I have done a link to the production of Sophocles' Electra that I directed back in 2001. And you can see from the aesthetic of it that it's actually quite different from what you might necessarily immediately think of as a Greek tragedy. You'll also see Tom Hiddleston's first acting gig. He's playing Orestes in it. And I have to say, when he walked into the audition room, the room just lit up. He's nauseating because not only is he a good actor, but he's really, really, really nice. And he's completely fluent in ancient Greek to the extent of being able to improvise in it. So in these two pictures then, we have a clash of our expectations and the reality. The vase, you have to learn how to read. And if it's in a museum, you would be justified in walking straight past it thinking, oh yeah, it's old, couple of blokes on it. The image from the Greek play we look at and we laugh, we deride it thinking that it's a load of nonsense, not realizing how innovative it is. Let's go on then to another couple of pictures. There we are. This is from Sir Peter Hall's oeuvre. We have on your right side a picture from the highly radical production of the Oresteia in 1980 at Britain's Royal National Theatre. And on the other side, a picture from his Oedipus, again at the National Theatre in the 2000s. Peter Hall has written a book actually called Exposed by the Mask, which argues that masks are an essential part of the production of Greek tragedy. He does not want to see people's emotions. He wants a blank canvas onto which the audience can project their emotions. And something very strange happens when you watch this. When you start watching one of these productions of Peter Hall's, you might feel alienated, that you can't understand what the masks are doing. But very, very quickly, you feel that the masks are moving, that they're emoting, and that you're seeing the characters' feelings through the mask. There's a very famous anecdote, famous amongst classicists, about the very first method actor called Pollux, who in the 4th century BCE was playing Sophocles' Electra. Electra grieves over an urn that she thinks contains her brother's ashes. Pollux used the ashes of his son, who had been killed the year before, and mourned over them for real in the performance. And there's documentary evidence of how his tears were real. Well, so far so good. People tend to use that unthinkingly, that anecdote. He was wearing a mask. So how could anybody see his tears? How could anybody know they were for real? And that's the magic quality of a mask. People thought they saw his tears, but they didn't really. So here we have an aesthetic of Greek tragedy that is based very much on the idea of alienating the audience so you can draw them in, so actually their reception, their perception, their projection create the meaning. Let's go on some other pictures. There's Fiona Shaw, there's Zoe Wanamaker. For those of you who, well, I'm sure all of you have watched the Harry Potter series, Fiona Shaw is Aunt Petunia, and Zoe is, I've forgotten her name, Madam Hooch, who teaches people how to fly on broomsticks. Anyway, Fiona on the left-hand side playing Electra. So that was in 1991 in the UK. I was the understudy on that performance, on that production. It was fascinating. The viscerality of her body, the extremes to which she pushed herself. It was inspirational, it was devastating. When I first saw, this production was first staged when I was at university. I was writing my honours thesis on Electra and Antigone. I was so blown away with it that I pestered the director, Deborah Warner, until she took pity on me when the show was remounted and she cast me as the understudy, even though I was extremely inexperienced. I was only, 21, just left university. It was an amazing, amazing experience. But looking at her body, let's contrast her body to what you've just seen in the masks, the vulnerability of the flesh, the open abjection of the body. The word abjection, A-B, J-E-C-T-I-O-N, it means the highest and the lowest that you can go. The depths of human experience, so deep, so painful, so awful that they actually become sublime. And that's how Fiona pushed herself to the absolute limits of an actor's endurance. I thought, until I got to play Electra for 6 months. And then, of course, I thought, I'm going to do one better than you. You lost 10 kilos. I'm going to lose 15 kilos. An extremely exhausting part to play. On the right-hand side, we have Zoe. Now, Fiona was 30 when she played Electra, which is about the right age if you're thinking about the chronology of the myth. Zoe was in her 50s when she played her. I interviewed Zoe for my PhD and asked her about her characterization. She was great. She said, oh, look, I'm in my 50s. My metabolism doesn't work anymore. I'm not going to lose weight, so I'll cover myself in a great, big, comfy trench coat, which we can say is my father's, and that will make me look vulnerable. So here, in terms of the aesthetic of the theatre design, we have two diametrically opposed ways of creating vulnerability. One to show the brutality, viscerality, and nakedness of the body, the other to cover it, to give the impression, like a mask, that there is a vulnerable body underneath. Moving on to some other images then. Here we have Laurence Olivier playing Oedipus. There we have the classic image from the 1950s, the old Vic. To us, it looks a little bit hammy, but remember too how, again, radical this was to be done in a commercial theatre in the West End. Well, whether you can say the Old Vic is the West End, in the 1950s. And then an image again of Fiona. If you look at this still, you might think, what, that we're talking about Tennessee Williams, Cat in a Hot Tin, no, not Cat in a Hot Tin Roof, A Streetcar Named Desire. That's the sort of look, isn't it? But actually it comes from Medea, Deborah Warner's Medea, back in 2001. An extremely different contemporary view on what Greek tragedy can do, on what the Medea story can be, if you like, something that is domesticated rather than magnificent. Moving on to another image, there we have Helen McCrory, again from Harry Potter. She's Draco Malfoy's mother in Harry Potter. And here's an interesting one. So this is an image from 1968, a production, an adaptation of Euripides' The Bacchae, which we'll talk about next week, done by Richard Schechner. He's the man who has written your set text for this semester, called Dionysus 69. The pun in 69 is completely intentional. One of the things that happens a lot when young people study theatre and start to create their own is that they think they're doing something really radical and avant-garde. Well, remember that probably it's been done before and done in a slightly more avant-garde way. So here we have a lot of naked 1960s hippie actors impersonating the birth of Dionysus. Now these pictures, these different frames of the aesthetics of Greek theatre, all do something different to you. And it's your reception that I want to talk about that is important, and how your reception of these images can correlate to how Greek tragedy was considered in the 5th century BCE. What does theatre mean to you? Well, something very different from what it meant to the Greeks. Theatre for an Athenian was a civic, religious duty. I'll talk to you next week about actually the beginnings of the Theatre of Dionysus, of the Festival of Dionysus, in which these Greek tragedies were performed, and how that connected to the sense of Greekness and of Athenian identity. But for now, I want you to think that instead of being a form of entertainment, which is what we think about a lot of theatre now, Greek theatre for the Greeks was a civic and religious duty, both to perform it and also to attend it. So the chorus, through most of the 5th century, the chorus of a Greek tragedy comprised of young men who were in training for the army, who were what's known as hoplites, the infantry, because it was thought that if you could work in a chorus in unison, dancing, singing, talking in unison, you would have a sense of collegiality that would mean that when you got into the battlefield, you would understand each other. There were in the 5th century professional actors. There'd be 3 as we go later in the 5th century for the productions. The audience comprised of the entire citizen body of Athens, if they could make it. So we're talking about between 30 and 15,000 men attending this. We're not dealing with slaves, we're not dealing with women. We have actually no way of knowing whether women attended these plays or not. And next week, and also when we talk about Antigone, I will describe the position of women to you, women in the 5th century, so you will be able to make up your own mind. We have 2 shreds of evidence, anecdotal evidence, that suggests that women were there, but as we've seen with the story of Pollux, anecdotes are unreliable at the best of times. So, citizens in this radical democracy where every male citizen was expected to vote in person for each piece of legislation that was passed, these men, these citizens were expected to attend these plays because it was thought that the process of watching these plays enabled the citizenship, the body of Athens, to come together, to address their fears and concerns, and to leave the theatre in a state that made them more capable as citizens to contribute to the polis. Polis is the Greek word for city. I'll deal with all of this next week because it's complicated, and I think we deserve a bit more time than we have here. What we're dealing, though, with in the Greek theatre that we're talking about now, the Festival of Dionysus, which again we'll discuss next week. 3 plays presented by three playwrights. Trilogies sometimes loosely connected plays, followed by what's known as a satyr play, which was kind of like a satirical skit. The only three playwrights we have left are Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, though we know that there were hundreds of other playwrights out there. So this in itself is really tricky in terms of reception. We think we might understand Greek tragedy, but actually we have three out of hundreds of playwrights. And think about Sophocles. We have 7 of his plays, and he wrote over 120 plays. So one of the big problems of being a classicist, trying to talk knowledgeably about Greek theatre, is that we don't know what the true context was. We cannot know unless there's some extraordinary discovery of new texts. They're all burnt down in the Great Library of Alexandria, first by Julius Caesar, then by the Christians. So we're a bit scuppered. All we can do is base our understanding on what we have left. And that is one reason why dealing with reception, i.e. the way that you perceive things, is probably more intellectually coherent than trying to say, this is what Greek tragedy was in the 5th century BC, because we simply don't know. What we do know, though, is that the shape of the Greek theatre, and here we have a rough drawing, it's been neatened up. So the actors would perform on the skene. The orchestra here is where the chorus would perform. The chorus and other actors would enter on the parados, and the audience would sit on the theatron. Theatron, theatre, comes from the Greek word theor, which means I see, I watch. Now in Greek, there's an amazing little thing that happens in language where you can turn an active verb, I watch, i.e. I watch you, into a self-reflexive verb. This is called the middle. And what this means is that the verb theor, I watch, turns into teaomai, which means I watch you for myself, and it rebounds back on me, and then it comes back again in an oscillation that means that it's an unending loop. Pretty funky. So think about an audience member sitting in the theatron, watching the actor on the skene. Their eyes go like that, bound off the actor, go back into themselves, create meaning, come back into the skene, go through the orchestra, create meaning, come back. In other words, it's an oscillation. Don't think about a line, think about a lava lamp. And here we have a picture of what remains of the theatre of Dionysus, in which the plays, the Greek tragedies, were performed initially. In the 5th century, it didn't look a bit like this. The theatre had been massively renovated, if you can say that, by the Romans when they conquered Greece. And so what we see today bears very, very little resemblance to anything that happened in the 5th century. But what is interesting about it is that the theatre is placed underneath the Acropolis. And so this centre of worship and the Pnyx, which is where the voting happened in the Athenian democracy, which is next door to it, which you can actually see. This theatre was situated under the seat of the biggest religious festivals for the Athenians, and in view of what we can basically say was the Athenian parliament, giving a sense through its geographical location of how important this actually was. So, for Greeks, for the Athenians, hang on, I've lost my whatsy. For the Athenians, tragedy was an integral part of their life. I'm going to try to move this so that you can just see. There we go. Paul Cartledge, Deep Plays in the Cambridge Companion to Greek Theatre. Paul says that tragedy was an active ingredient and part of the dreams of the Athenians. And that's really important. Tragedy was not something we went to for a good cry and a snuffle and a bit of entertainment. Tragedy was something that worked in us and through us and was part of our identity. Going on from that, Pat Easterling, the lovely Pat, talks about what we might see as reception. And this is interesting. So Pat is the Emerita Professor of Greek, both in Cambridge and at London University. She's an amazing woman. She's trained everyone, including myself. She's extraordinary. You would think that somebody with her background of traditional classics would actually be relatively conservative, but she's not. She is saying that everything that seems to be related to Greekness, to classics, to Greek theatre, to Greek tragedy is potentially relevant to our understanding. In other words, the baggage that you bring creates meaning. So let's think finally about the baggage that we're living in now. In the 5th century, there was a vicious war between the Spartans and the Athenians. And as a result of this war, there was a plague in Athens. Thucydides, the Greek historian, writes extraordinary, heartbreaking analysis and descriptions of what would happen, of how people would throw corpses off a pyre, literally steal the pyre to burn their own dead because there wasn't enough wood to go around. The starvation, the quarantining, the filth and destruction of the Athenian plague. So that was 427 to 430 BCE. In 429, Sophocles wrote Oedipus the King. The premise of Oedipus the King is that Oedipus, the king of Thebes, must find out what is causing the plague of Thebes. Thebes has been destroyed by dying cattle, dying people, suppurating wounds. In other words, it is completely under the thumb of a plague. And Oedipus finds out what is the cause. And of course, he is the cause, because unwittingly he has killed his father and married his mother. Think about that in relation to the date. 427 for 430, the plague. 429, Oedipus, the king, is written by Sophocles. Sophocles is using a myth, is using theatre, is using tragedy to comment on the situation at that time in Athens. And that's where we get to the aomai, the audience watching their story couched in myth for themselves rebounding. So what does this mean for us today with theatre? Especially now, where we see these images, where this is life now. This is from Italy, where people are carrying coffins out. And there's a story that the army has been asked to basically dig up coffins because they've run out of enough space in graveyards for all the dead. We are living in a time of plague, maybe not as bad as the Athenian plague, but a time where we are at the mercy of biological, viral matters outside our lives. But where's the play? Where's our Oedipus the King? Theatre does not mean to us now what it meant to the Greeks then. So as we talk about Greek theatre in the next 2 weeks, I want you to think about this and think about the importance, the radical significance of theatre to the Athenians. If you can imagine a form of theatre that can encapsulate the horror of what we see in this picture and the weirdness of what you're going through now, I will be fascinated to hear what it might be, because I don't think that's possible now. Theatre has moved. Instead, we have Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. We don't have theatre. So, as we come to next week, talking about Euripides' Bacchae, and the following week when we talk about Sophocles' Antigone, let's keep in mind the radical nature of theatre, that ancient Greek tragedy was and is the most radical, the most political, the most significant, the most culturally important form of theatre there has ever been or ever will be. Thanks very much. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.